Hey all, today I'm going to be explaining to you the various different types of property investment strategies in the UK. I'm going to be explaining them in moderate detail and giving you the positives and negatives of each strategy. I'll also be telling you what investment strategies I use so that hopefully by the end of the video you'll be able to pick the best strategy for you. Please make sure to drop a comment below with your absolute favourite strategy or the strategy that you think sounds best. Now let's get into the video. The first strategy that we're going to talk about today is the property flipping strategy, sometimes called buy to sell. This strategy is really great because it builds cash reserves faster than any other strategy because A, it's a fairly quick strategy. The typical property flip in the UK takes around 6 to 8 months from start to finish. And obviously B, when you sell the property, you get 100% of the cash instead of refinancing onto a loan. Because obviously when you refinance onto a loan, you can't get 100% loan. You can only get say 75 or an 80% loan, which means that you tie up that 20% or 25% into the house because obviously you're keeping the house, so you tie it in. Whereas when you sell the property, you get 100% of the cash, so you get more. But I suppose the biggest downside is that obviously when you sell the property, that's it. You don't get to keep the property and get that monthly rental income coming into your account every single month. You have to go out there and find property flip number 2, property flip number 3, and property flip number 4. So it's not really a reliable or a consistent strategy. You obviously have to go out and find new deals instead of just doing one deal, keeping the property and getting that monthly income. So this strategy has two different ways that you can do it. The first way works in any kind of market, whether it's a rising market, a falling market, or a stagnant market. And the other way only works in a rising market. Let's talk about this one first. The first way, as I said, is the one that only works in a rising market. This strategy is really simple and doesn't really require any skill or knowledge. It relies entirely on capital appreciation. You effectively just go out, buy a property in cash or maybe with a bridging loan and hold it for 6, 12 or 24 months and then you sell it. Back in 2003, 4 and 5, the markets were going up about 8, 10, even 15% a year. So you could pretty much just go out and buy a property that's in fairly good condition, hold it for 2 years and sell it and you've made 25%. That's good profit. I don't really recommend this way because it relies entirely on luck and not skill, and the market can turn on you in an instant. Obviously if the market moves down, you're not going to get that appreciation, which means you're going to lose money. So what about the other way? This is what I like to call buying the gap, and it's a much better form of property flipping because it requires skill and knowledge and doesn't really rely as much on luck. What you want to do is go out and buy a property that's really in need of refurbishment, that's in an area with a lot of nicely refurbished properties. You can get this property for a lot cheaper than the refurbished ones, and often a lot cheaper than the refurbishments themselves will even cost. If a property needs 10 to 15k of refurbishments, you could probably get this property 50 to 60k cheaper than a recently refurbished property that's the exact same size, faces the same direction and looks pretty much exactly the same. So obviously this way, when you do the renovation, you can kind of build in some profit because even if the market falls, you've obviously still got this buffer or this gap that you've created. Feel free to watch some of my other videos on property flipping where I go much more in depth on this strategy and talk about all the costs and taxes and stamp duties involved. The next strategy we're going to talk about is the buy to let strategy. This is where you effectively buy a property and rent it out to a tenant. This strategy is really great because it's a long-term strategy, which means that you can benefit from the rental income every single month for years to come. You can also benefit from capital appreciation. Typically, over the long term of say 20 to 30 years, properties across the country always rise in value. So obviously that means that if you sell it 20 or 30 years after you buy it, you can probably get more than if you sell it 1 year after you buy it. This isn't always the case. Obviously when we go through a recession, the market drops. But obviously over the long term, the markets have pretty much always increased. There's two real downsides to this strategy though. The first downside is that you have to lock up some of your money. Obviously when you buy a property, you buy it with a deposit and that deposit always stays in the house. Now if you sell it with a flipping strategy, you get that deposit back. But if you refinance, you don't get that deposit back because obviously you can never refinance onto a 100% loan. You always have to leave say 20 or 25% of your money in that property. The second disadvantage is that you have to deal with a tenant. every day, every month, every year. You have to pretty much be on call 24/7 in case something breaks or needs to be repaired. That obviously can be mitigated by getting a property manager to obviously take all of those calls and do all that repairing for you. Now this strategy also has two main ways. You've got your standard buy-to-let method and your BRRRR method. Let's talk about the buy-to-let method first. For this method, you buy a property in cash or with a buy-to-let loan, and you go out and you find a tenant. That tenant then lives in the property and pays you rent every single month, which will cover the mortgage, the expenses, factors in any vacancy, any tax, and will leave you with pure cash flow profit every single month. Now this strategy is fairly good, but it does have a downside as well, and that's that it ties up obviously a lot of your cash, and you have to use a pretty large deposit to buy the property in the first place. For this reason, this strategy only really works that well if you have a lot of cash to go out and buy properties one after the other, because obviously otherwise you're going to have to buy a property and then save for another 5 or 6 years. Maybe you can save quicker, but it's going to be quite a long time before you've got enough money to go out and buy your next one. So the best way to work around this is to use the second way, which is the BRRRR method, and it effectively combines this buy-to-let strategy with the buying the gap strategy. And what you want to do here is again buy a property that's in need of refurbishment. And when I say that, I mean you want to look for the property that has the gross green or blue carpets and the pink bathtub or the green bathtub, not the nice pristine white freshly tiled stuff. The stuff that's got the broken kitchen, the blue bathtub with all the mould that doesn't look like it's been cleaned in about 25 years. That's the kind of property you want. You're then going to renovate the property, which will help you generate that profit or that gap. But this time, instead of selling the property, you're going to refinance it. So let's go through a super simple example, shall we? So what we're going to do is buy a property for 100k. We're going to use a bridging loan, about a 25% deposit bridging loan, which means we've got 25k deposit and 75k as the loan. We're then going to do some work to the property. Let's call it about a 15k refurb. And the property is now worth 150k. We refinance onto a 25% buy-to-let loan, which means we've got 37.5k tied up in the property as our deposit, and we get given the loan of 112.5k. So obviously we have to repay our earlier loan of 75k, which means we have 37.5k in cash left. We obviously have to pay for that refurb that we did, about 15k, and our initial deposit that we put in was 25k. That means we've only got about 2.5k of our cash left in the deal, which is much better than the first way, whereas obviously we would have put our 25k in and just left it there. Now this is a super simple example that doesn't take into account tax or stamp duty or legal costs or anything else like that, but that's kind of the numbers that you're looking at. Same kind of thing though. We're then going to go out and find a tenant to live in our property. They're going to pay us rent every single month, which we can use to pay off the mortgage and the expenses, and obviously cover any vacancy. But this time, we've only got 2.5k tied up in the deal because we got our 37.5k back. So we can use that 37.5k to go out and buy a property straight away to move on to project number 2, instead of obviously having to save up another 25k to go out and buy a property. Be sure to watch my video on buy-to-let, where I go much more in depth on this strategy and talk about all of the costs involved, including tax and stamp duty. Also, if you've enjoyed the video so far, or you found it useful, be sure to drop a like down below for the YouTube algorithm, and subscribe if you haven't already. The third strategy is property development. Now this strategy takes a lot more cash, but the rewards are also much greater. This strategy is typically for people that have a lot more experience and a lot more money, because obviously you're going to need an architect to design the property and help get you planning permission, and then you're going to need a full team to be able to build this property from the ground up. That means you're going to need builders, electricians, plumbers, roofers, window people, floor people, everything. You're going to need the whole lot. Now this strategy is really great because the profit margins can be huge, especially if you're building high-end properties or flats or hotels. But obviously there's a lot more room for error. If things go wrong, it can delay the project by absolutely ages. It can be delayed by years instead of by a month or two. Effectively, what you want to do here is buy a parcel of land or a small property on a larger piece of land that's quite out of the ordinary. You then knock the property down and build a brand new state-of-the-art home or flats or a hotel on that parcel of land, and then obviously you can sell the completed development and recoup all of the money that you put into it and a lot of profit on top. There are even some loans available for this strategy as well, usually called development finance. But this financing is only really available for people that have a lot of experience in property rental and property development. Now the next few strategies have a lower return, are more risky and have a lower success rate, and these strategies don't always work. But I'll include them just for completeness of the video because they are still strategies which can definitely work. Now the fourth strategy is rent to rent. This strategy can be good because you don't have to save up a deposit, because you don't actually own the property, you just rent it and then rent it out to someone else for a bit more. This strategy is a bit worse though because the profit margins are always going to be smaller, because obviously when you're renting the property before you rent it out to the second person, the owner of the property is going to want enough rent that covers his mortgage and makes him a bit of profit. So it's just going to effectively make your profit margin that much smaller. So let's say as an example, using the earlier buy-to-let techniques, you've got a property that can rent out for £1,000. Your interest-only mortgage on this property is about £300. Not including any of the other expenses, you're making £700 a month. Now if you were to do the same idea with the rent-to-rent strategy, you could obviously rent the property out for £1,000 a month still, but you wouldn't be paying £300 a month for the mortgage. You'd probably have to pay £500 a month for the rent, because the owner would want at least £300 to cover his mortgage and probably £100 or £200 as well as a cheeky profit. So you're probably only making £500 a month instead of £700 a month. And there's a lot of other expenses and complexities with this strategy as well. I've also made a video that goes through the rent to rent strategy in more detail and shows why it's not necessarily as cracked up as a lot of people make it out to be. The next strategy is lease options. This strategy can be quite good because it means you don't have to have a deposit ready right now. You can find a property and agree a price with a seller and then spend 5 to 10 years saving up that deposit, and then you can go and buy the property for that agreed amount. That means you'll probably be getting quite a good discount because, as I said earlier, the market tends to pretty much always go up over the long term. But this does heavily depend on the seller not finding a legal loophole to your lease option agreement. So you could, unfortunately, end up being stuck without a property even if you wanted to exercise that option. So what you want to do here is find a property where the owner is trying to sell it but he can't get the price he wants for it because that price is too high. You agree to pay this higher price to him, but in 5 to 10 years. That means you can spend 5 to 10 years getting the deposit together, and then by then the property is actually probably going to be worth more than that and you can get quite a nice discount. So you create a lease option agreement, get him to sign it, and this gives you the option, not the obligation, to buy the property. Once you've entered into the option, you then control the property and you rent it out to someone else or back to the owner and continue paying the mortgage, which means that you get a couple £100 in cash flow each month. Those 5 to 10 years go by, and providing the property market has accelerated, you exercise your option and buy the property. You can then probably sell it on for quite a nice discount. The only downside to this property is that the owner could take you to court because it's fairly easy for him to say that he was duped or tricked into signing this lease option agreement and he didn't know what he was doing, and it's fairly easy to get out of it and you'll be stuck with no property. The next strategy is deal sourcing. Deal sourcing can be great because all you need to do is find a deal for free and then sell it on. But deal sourcing only really works if you have significant experience in property, let's say 20 years experience, and you know a lot of people, which means that you can get off-market deals that aren't advertised to the public. With deal sourcing, you need to be able to find a deal from an investor or a landlord that wants to sell off his entire portfolio, or directly from the owner of estate agents before they list the property for sale, or even from a bank's repossession department before they list the property for sale. You then structure the entire deal. You calculate the numbers like the profit and the return on investment. You structure the financing and organise it. You organise any refurbishments necessary and you find a tenant. And you can then sell this entire package to an external investor who will buy that deal as it is and pay you a bit of money, say a couple of grand, for putting it all together. However, obviously, you need a lot of experience to be able to put this kind of deal together and find the off-market deal in the first place. I've also made a video on deal sourcing and if it really is viable. As always, if you've enjoyed the video and want to learn more about property investing, feel free to check out some of my other videos. Alternatively, subscribe to the channel and ding the notification bell. That way, you'll be alerted when I upload a new video. Cheers!